Hey there, welcome to the Theology of podcast. I'm Benjamin.
And I'm Riker.
And we're two college students who love studying scripture and having meaningful biblical conversations.
When we think about theology, most of our thoughts probably stay within the four walls of the church. But in doing so, we're really limiting our understanding of God's infinite nature.
And so each episode will be tackling an everyday, secular-seeming topic and discussing what the faith has to say about it both conceptually and practically.
So thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to buckle up, keep your hands and feet inside the proverbial vehicle at all times, and enjoy the ride.
Let's go.
Hey everybody, welcome back. So glad to have you join us once again for another episode of the Theology of. This week, we're going to be continuing our conversation about community. And most of our episodes can be listened to in any order. But for this episode specifically, since it is the second part, if you haven't heard the first part yet, go ahead and check that out before this. Because in that episode, we establish what community is and talk about the biblical storyline of community. So check that out if you haven't, but if you have and you're here ready for more, get ready because we got lots to talk about.
Yeah, so last week we jumped into a whole wave of biblical ties to the word community and the examples that we see throughout Scripture of what community is really like, and really great examples of how we as people have had this rooted in our beings since the very beginning and even before the beginning. If you remember how you were talking about how God in the Trinity really sets that standard for us. But this episode, we're kind of looking at the opposite and where in our daily lives, living in 2020 or any of the years that you're listening to this after this, where in those have we stepped away from this? And where do we struggle nowadays to find genuine community? And then finally, as always, we're going to conclude with a practical application and how we can really take these things to heart and how we can apply them to the ways that we view community in our own daily lives through work, through school, through church, and through just life in general. But before we get to that, starting with the struggle that we're currently all going through and have been going through in our 21st century, what do we see as potential inhibitors of us finding genuine community?
Yeah, that really is the $1 million question. I think every single person listening right now can relate to this struggle that we have of finding community.
Yeah.
Because in our culture, we are so fiercely individualistic, so focused on being independent and self-sufficient, which isn't true for every culture. There are other cultures that are very communal and very focused on the tribe rather than the individual member.
Yeah.
But our danger as a culture is getting so caught up in this idea of being an individual that we forget that we're also meant to be communal. Also, just want to make it clear that it's not a terrible thing to be an individualistic culture.
Right.
It's not like a communal culture is so much better because they each have pros and cons.
Right.
But I think one of the big cons of an individualistic culture is the fact that we can be less connected and more isolated.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that with the rise of social media and everything becoming more and more virtual, and obviously that has really taken a toll on us in 2020 during COVID-19, but the idea that everything is within the click of a button and, super easy to get to, and you're still sort of together, but you're virtual, so you're not together. But it's still, this false sense of community that we get through the internet and through Facebook and Instagram and whatnot. I think with the rise of that, and again, not to say that anything's bad with those, but with the rise of social media and just how obsessed we have become within that culture and how we're so focused on our self-image and stuff like that, we have slowly just drifted away from traditions that we may have had in the last 50, 100 years that when technology and social media wasn't a problem, we engaged in with each other because that's all that people had. And again, talking back to our episode 2 with technology, that we can't say, remember the good old days when we used to have this? Like, we can't say that because we are in the time now that we do have all this. So we have to figure out what to do about it. So we got to figure out something to do about it and get people into communities once again and out of just this bubble around myself that I've created. And that actually reminds me of a really good quote that I found from a book from a guy named Robert Putnam. He was a Harvard professor, and he wrote a book based off of an essay that he wrote back in the 90s. And it was called Bowling Alone, The Decline of America's Social Capital. And the book was called Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. So in his book, he offered suggestions and thoughts on where he saw America going down the drain in regards to community. But there's a really good quote here regarding that book. And it says, "The decline in social capital, according to Putnam, is not related to the increase in size of government, race, changes in the form of family unit, the economy, or a lack of education. Instead, he believes that 4 specific causes contribute the most to the change: the increased pressures of time and money, the increasing distance and lack of connectivity between living spaces due to urban sprawl, overexposure to television, and stark generational differences that inhibit intergenerational bonding." He addresses several methods to adjust the social climate and hopefully improve social capital. And we'll, again, get into those suggestions a little bit later, as well as suggestions that we have come up with on our own. But you're totally right. There's a problem that just these natural things that have woven their way into our society have created and pretty much tore us apart from each other and have built boundary lines where we didn't have them before. That is kind of removed this idea of really deep social community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, from what Putnam is saying, it sounds like he is pinpointing all of these national characteristics of 21st century America, like the way that our houses are designed and our entertainment,
right,
and things like that. The fourth one that he mentions actually is another category for why loneliness and lack of community is so prevalent. That's because of generational disconnect. And we've already mentioned this a little bit with the idea of social media.
Right.
But Sam Albury, a pastor and speaker, put it this way. He says, "Friend has changed from a noun into a verb," talking about the way that we use it in social media.
Interesting.
Because no longer do we have friends being a subject,
Sure.
but we friend doing an action to somebody, and we equate those as the same thing when they really aren't. And it's a counterfeit of true connection.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about with how we've put social media and our connections with people on the internet up on such high of a pedestal, because that has become the new normal, right? If you friend somebody on Facebook, you're friends. And we've equated those two terms with each other, like you were just saying, when there's totally a difference there. If you saw them in person every single day, like you would maybe a genuine friend that you had a long-lasting friendship with, things would be different. You would see a lot of differences between the way that you interact on and through technology to the way that you interact in person with each other. And the fact that we're making those two words like friend on Facebook or follow on Instagram the same as friend or best friend or community in person, it doesn't really add up, but we've totally made it that way because we're all so connected through social media and the internet nowadays. And that's become the new normal.
Yeah. And it even goes past the sense of just wanting to be connected and goes into almost a lust for being connected.
Yeah.
Because the word that is so prevalent in our generation is the concept of FOMO.
Yeah.
And that fear of missing out on what's going on around us. which I think is the diagnosis of the problem that we're addressing right now.
Sure.
That disconnect.
Yeah.
The third category might come as a surprise, but it's spiritual disconnect that causes fracture in our sense of community.
Yeah.
Because we have this ideal, this goal in mind of being unified in the church. And there is that unity that Christ brings.
Right.
But also, part of us being broken, sinful beings is we bring some of that baggage into the church. But instead of being open with our issues and letting one another bear our burdens, churches become a spiritual dress up where we make ourselves look like we have everything together, no problems, and we only develop these surface deep relationships because of this mask that we're putting on. But really, it's not satisfying us. We're not getting better because we're not even acknowledging that there's a problem to begin with.
Yeah, dude, that is so true. Every week I go to my church and wonder how many people have failed miserably that week, as we all do as Christians, but we're all putting on the same smiling face that, I'm just here for my sermon and my worship, and then I'm headed home, and I can't bring any of that to the table because we're ashamed. We don't want to open up that much. We have a fear of being rejected is a big thing. But the genuine Christ-like community that we saw in the Bible that we talked about last episode, with people selling absolutely everything, living in poverty together, dude, they did everything together. And so they would have known everything about each other. They would have known their deepest, darkest secrets. They would have known their very highs and their very lows. And they would have been there with each other through that entire thing. And so to see our churches becoming where we just put on a mask as we go in every Sunday, that really saddens me. And it shows the lack of depth that we're getting with the people that we're worshiping alongside.
Yeah. And just to clarify, we're talking about emotional masks, not physical masks.
True.
That's its own
entire conversation. That's funny.
But speaking of which, the last category of reasons why we have this disconnect is temporally, because right now, during the season that we're in, it's COVID-19 season. And that really has affected our sense of community. But I think sometimes we are in denial of the real effect that it's had on us. Even just myself, it's hard to really pinpoint just how much it is affecting me and my own sense of community. Do you have any sense of how it's impacted you and those around you?
Absolutely, man. I had to move home from school, and it was so wonderful to spend time with my family for the last 6 months and get to be in community with them. But the people that I see day in, day out in my college and in my campus ministry, and the people that I go to church with, I wasn't seeing them, and I wasn't actively engaged in that community. And we tried to do like online meetings and like hangouts, and it wasn't the same. There was a screen in between us all, and where we could share a meal and laugh and cry with each other in person. We couldn't do that anymore because it was just kind of awkward that we'd all be in our kitchens alone, just sharing about our week, and something be really hard, but it's weird to bring up over a screen. There's just like those natural barriers that have arisen from this situation. And so, yeah, I've totally been affected by that, and how I've seen how others around me are just longing for that community daily because they don't have anything anymore. And I was just very lucky that, I could be with my family and a few select friends during this entire thing. But some people that they don't have anything anymore because everybody's moved back home and they can't go back home or something like that. It really pains me to see how people are just handling it by themselves. And it's really sad.
Right.
But even if you're not listening to this during COVID-19, there will come a day that it is over. We can talk about the temporal side of things through any situation. And that might be a election season, or that might be a time where there are seasons of hardships within your life that came up recently that, you're really struggling to find community. There's just a lot of things that we could throw into this temporal category, not just necessarily COVID-19, but there are just natural inhibitors that we get temporally that throw themselves in the way of us making genuine community.
Yeah, I think those points you bring up are spot on, especially with physically being distanced from community in a lot of senses. But it really is so important that we recognize that this does have an effect on us. We can't just ignore it.
Yeah.
Which that might be some of our cultural instincts surfacing. But we have to acknowledge it and then use that as an opportunity to change. So hopefully by this point, we can all agree that this conversation is so relevant to where we're at right now. And we really do need to think biblically about what it means to have true, vibrant community.
So hopefully that wasn't too much of a downer, right? Talking about our current experiences with community and how it's failing in our lives. It's quite sad to look at our friendships and our relationships and see where we're lacking in how Christ has called us to love others. But for the rest of the episode, we get to look at more of a recipe for healthy community and how we believe there are some really core principles to engaging with others daily in this Christ-like community that we've been fantasizing about for this entire episode and the last. So let's jump into those.
Yeah, this is the fun part of the episode where we really get to focus on what makes good friendship, what makes good community.
Yeah.
Starting off our recipe on healthy biblical community is shared experience. This is something I've been learning a lot about in my own life recently, but before I mention that, I want to hear your take on that concept.
Shared experience. It reminds me of storytelling, our first episode, right?
Throwback.
The things, yeah, exactly. The things that we share in common, we tell stories about. And it's like, oh yeah, that reminds me of another time that this happened. And, it bonds you together. We talked about how stories are the things that hold us together. And this is a great example of that. Shared experience is the thing that really unites us and gives us some common ground for us to step on in a friendship.
Right. Yeah, it really is the currency of community.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Because friendship doesn't just happen. It's not something that just appears. Yeah. It's something that needs to be invested in.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have shared time, shared experience, then you're not going to get that depth and that level of intimacy. So whether that's something big or a bunch of little things, having those shared experiences are so, so important and something to really prioritize.
Totally. I mean, just think about it now. Your closest friends in life, you could probably think of a couple of quick names that come to mind. How much have you gone through with them? It could be one either really good or traumatic experience that really shaped your friendship from the way out, right? It showed you a good or a really bad side of that person that you have grown to love and you have grown to appreciate and care for. Or it could be a multitude of a bunch of different experiences. You've been through it all with them, right? You've been through the good and the bad, the really beautiful times in each other's lives and the really crappy times in each other's lives, right? That idea that shared experiences is what really draws us together, and the amount or the depth of those experiences has something to say about how close you are to that person.
Right. And those shared experiences are the points where our timelines interweave with one another as we share life with one another. Because as we talked about in the first episode, community is built on things that are common.
Yeah.
Things that are shared.
Absolutely.
So if you're making a healthy community, first things first, put in 2 cups of shared experience. Next, add a tablespoon of vulnerability.
Oof, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a really big and not always the most fun part about building relationships, and yet
Yeah.
it's so important.
Hmm.
This is how C.S. Lewis highlights its importance. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up in a safe, in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable.
Wow.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic. To love at all is to be vulnerable. That first sentence is so true because we are taking a risk every time that we make a new friend, every time that we build a new relationship from the ground up. We're taking a risk because we have to invest into that relationship parts of ourselves that are private. And if we want that relationship to go anywhere and for it to get any deeper, we're going to have to be okay with putting ourselves out there. And I think that's another thing that contributes to our isolation culture is we're not willing to do that. We have a lot of baggage from other experiences in our life that we're not willing to share with other people, and it takes a lot of time for us to open back up. And I totally understand that there's healing within that, and if you had something traumatic happen to you, that there should be ample time for you to heal before having to do that again. But at the same time, I'm just encouraging that we as humans and as Christians, that we be okay with taking risks sometimes and be okay with putting ourselves out there to the people that we feel God is leading us to. And that doesn't mean for us to go and share our entire life story with some guy on the street.
Mm-hmm.
That means for us to prayerfully consider the people that we are sharing our lives with and really just considering how deep we're going with them, because that is what makes those communities and those friendships last and be super, super unbreakable.
Right. It definitely does take discernment to know who to trust with those deep parts of ourselves and who not to share everything with.
Yeah.
But you're totally right when you talked about how we have this tendency to hide ourselves.
Right.
And that's part of our isolation culture. And really, that goes all the way back to our ancestors, Adam and Eve, hiding in the garden, like we talked about last episode.
Totally.
But the only way that we can get better is to let others come close, right? For example, a surgeon has to be right there next to you during an operation. They have to have access to the things that are wrong to be able to bring healing.
Yeah.
And so do the people around us. We have to be open. And the cool thing is when we start to open up, then other people feel like they have the freedom to open up as well. Right. And I think a lot of times we buy into this lie that Satan tells us that, oh, if they only knew how broken I was, then they wouldn't love me anymore. Yeah. But when you think back in your life at those times when people took that step of courage to be honest and be open with you, it can sometimes even raise your respect for them and deepen the relationship.
Yeah. And I think about how many relationships in my own life have become that much deeper just because I've taken that step, or the other person has taken that step, and I see how badly they want this relationship or how deep they want to invest into it. And so, yeah, it's an important step, is vulnerability and being willing to risk yourself for the other person.
For sure. So to recap, first add 2 cups of shared experience, then a tablespoon of vulnerability. Next up, we have an ounce of intentionality. Intentionality is so, so important to biblical community, biblical friendship, because friendship isn't a passive thing. It takes
Right.
active effort among all the different parties.
Right.
Because if we just assume that, oh, when I run into this person, then we'll talk and then we'll grow closer to one another,
Right.
it's just not gonna happen.
Hmm.
It really takes that mindfulness and that willingness to be proactive. Ralph Waldo Emerson said it this way: go often to the house of thy friend, for weeds choke the unused path. Which is, I think, a beautiful way to put it.
Oh, yeah.
If we aren't being intentional, then the friendship is naturally just going to start to drift apart. Because it makes sense if we're not around them, we're not thinking about them, we're not living life together. It's just the natural result.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me, again, like we were talking about earlier, of our passive culture, and everything is within a touch of a button, and you can do this and this, and no effort is required on your part. But maybe it's time for us to start putting some effort into these relationships and these friendships, because without it, like you said, the weeds will grow over the unused path. And this reminds me actually of something that my campus minister has brought up time and time again when he's talking about how to interact with students and ways to invite people into your life and to doing life with them. But he says that anytime that you might reach out to somebody, you can say, hey, man, let's go get coffee. Nowadays, they will respond with, sure, great, sounds good. It's like, okay, when when do we go get coffee? When are you, they just simply are okay with the idea, and they want you to take some of the initiative to start that conversation and get things going. And so through that, we've learned that, hey man, let's go get coffee. And then they'll respond with sure. And you're like, okay, great. Tuesday, Thursday, which one works? Or like, what time between 9 and 5 does this work? We have to be the ones to start that initiative and begin those conversations, because again, we live in a passive culture that just wants things done for us. And if the cool thing is if we get enough people seeing the trend of our culture going into this passivity with our friendships, with relationships and stuff like that, we can hopefully turn that around for the better to make it more of the minority rather than majority of people doing so.
It is possible. We just have to take that responsibility and recognize that it's not just everyone else's fault.
Right.
But I have an active role that I can play in developing community around me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really a really convicting step for us to take.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next up, we've got a pinch of honesty.
Just a pinch.
Just a pinch. So, Benjamin, why do you think this is an important part of this recipe? Why is it an ingredient that we can't go without?
Yeah, that is such a crucial part of how we can really reshape our view of friendships and relationships of those around us. It's because, similar to vulnerability, it's being honest about who you are, but also being honest about how you see other people and how they are going about their walk with other people and with Christ and just life in general. And before you go out into your day and call out everything wrong you see with your friends, it's important that we be honest with our friends in a very God-honoring way and a biblical way. And this reminds me of Hebrews 10, verse 24, where it says, let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but rather encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. So there are two verbs there that we talked about, actually, another episode. I can't remember which one it was, but we talked about how there is motivate, or maybe in some translations it says spur on, and the other is encourage. And both of those things, motivate can sound good, encourage definitely sounds good. But when we think of maybe spur on, it can seem a little bit more negative because the very idea of a spur is something that hurts, right? If you think about in context of a horse or another animal that you would use a spur on, it's meant to kind of get them going. It hurts because it's kind of a kick in the side, but it's something that ultimately gets them going in the right direction. And so this idea of spurring each other on goes kind of hand in hand with honesty. Is we're kind of calling out those things that might not be so great about that person, and the ways that we've seen how they've been tearing this person down rather than building them up. That can be a really hard thing to do because you don't want to ruin that friendship. But when you feel that you are at that level with that person, that you can maybe say, hey, man, I've noticed that you've been pretty angry lately and it's been hurting me and the others around you. Let's talk about that. Or, I've been noticed that you've been neglecting some of your other friendships lately for video games or social media or something like that. It's just approaching it in a way that isn't hurtful, but it's helping them see what other people are seeing around them. And hopefully if they have a good attitude about it, they'll say, I appreciate you telling me that, because obviously I was just in my own world thinking I was doing the right thing. But when we approach people and tell them how we're feeling, that's genuine relationship. And if they can't deal with that, then, it's kind of coming back on you if it's worth being in a relationship that you can't be honest with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have to, again, remember to check our motivation behind confronting other people.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and we have to remember to look for our own logs before trying to pick out those specks.
Yeah.
Other people's eyes.
Absolutely.
But it really is, the purpose isn't to tear the other person down and say, hey, these are all the ways that you're terrible.
Right.
But it's because you love them and you see a better potential that you want them to pursue.
Right.
Oscar Wilde puts it really, really brutally. He says, true friends stab you in the front.
Oh, wow.
Which, for all you people pleasers out there, is so hard, because it's even harder than stabbing someone in the back. You can see the pain and the grimace on their face when you're confronting them about that sin in their life.
Yeah.
And yet, when this is done in a healthy way, it can bring so much healing and so much beauty, which is really what we're going after when we're trying to pursue godly community.
Yeah.
So far, we have shared experience, vulnerability, intentionality, and honesty all whisked together to develop true biblical community. Next up, we're going to add to the mixture a liter of humility.
Wow, that's a lot of humility.
Yeah, it's a lot, but we need that much because it's so important. A great example of this type of humility in friendship that we see from Scripture is the relationship between David and Jonathan, which is just the classic example of biblical friendship in Scripture.
Right. Yeah.
But the way that Jonathan gives of himself to David to help his friend is beautiful, especially honing in on 1 Samuel 20, when Jonathan's basically supporting David in his escape from Saul, which at first seems like a nice thing for Jonathan to do, right? He's just being a good friend.
Yeah.
But the implications of what he's doing is he's practically giving up the throne to David, because Jonathan is next in line to become king, and he knows that David is anointed and is going to become king. And so he, instead of fighting against David and trying to hold that position for himself, he gives it up in an act of pure humility.
Yeah, that's such a great story, man. And that reminds me, 2 chapters earlier in 1 Samuel 18, um, there's this beautiful verse where it says, "Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul." And just to continue furthering the importance of that relationship and how beautiful of a foundation that they had already laid. And then, like you said, Jonathan, if basically just giving up the throne in humility to David is just demonstration of how important humility is in our own lives. And I think it's so important to focus our energy in our relationships on building each other up rather than glorifying self and having this idea that you're not the most important person in this relationship. And, if it's just a 2-person relationship, then great. You have your answer on who is the most important. And that just kind of gives this very nice, natural back and forth of, if both people think that the other person is the most important, then you're going to be constantly pouring into each other, just back and forth. And there's going to be no room for pride, but there is enough room for you to celebrate each other and each other's accomplishments, and for people to gain feeling and worth out of that. But it's just, again, like a beautiful picture if both of you in that relationship feel the same about how to bring each other up and to be humble in yourself. It really just makes the relationship so much closer and so much more beautiful.
And to go along with that, it really makes sense why humility is important, because if we come into a relationship only to then be receiving from ourselves, then there's not even a need for the relationship, right?
Exactly.
We just do that on our own. But
Right.
the reason why we do have those relationships is so that others can pour into us. And while they pour into us, we can then pour into them.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Alrighty, folks. Next up, we're going to add 2 sticks of soft borders.
You're going to keep going with this, aren't you?
Oh, we're taking it all the way. You know it.
We've made it this far. We might as well keep going.
Right.
All right. So what do you mean by soft borders?
Mm-hmm. In communities, there's this tightrope that we have to walk, because on one side, there's a danger of having hard set borders where this is my friend group and no one else can join, and it becomes a clique,
right?
Which isn't healthy.
Right.
And then on the other side of things, you might think, oh, to just have no borders, that's even better.
Right.
But if we don't have intentional groups of people that we're pouring into, and we just let it be nebulous and all-encompassing, then it's not going to be as effective.
Yeah.
Because it's not as defined. And so, taking both of those into account, we're trying to find this middle ground of having soft borders where we have a set community and some boundaries set within that. And yet people can still come in, and not only they can come in, but we're welcoming others in.
Yeah.
And showing love. But man, is that hard to navigate.
Totally. Another thing, going to a secular university, we as Christians tend to stick together, and that's not a bad thing in any regard. But we tend to clump together and be very comfortable. We're great with our Christian group, and that's about it. We go on Wednesday nights or Thursday nights or whatever it is, and we're very comfortable with that. But at the same time, we're called to live on mission, and those two, like being comfortable and living on mission, don't really go hand in hand. And so, like you said, having soft borders and being able to welcome people into those groups and really get to know them. And like you said, that blooms into a wonderful friendship, but also not going around just wanting to be included in everything, because you can't have that many friendships that go that deep. It's just not possible.
Yeah. This is something that personally I'm still growing a lot in.
Yeah.
Because growing up, I never really defined the friends that I had. I didn't say, oh, this person's my best friend, or these are my people. And to an extent, I think that was good, to be welcoming and not exclude people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But something that I'm realizing is just trying to be friends with every single person you meet isn't going to work. You're just going to burn yourself out.
Right.
And to go along with that, we read in Proverbs 18:24, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother.
Yeah. Amen to that.
Yeah, it's really more about the quality than the quantity, which is hard for us in the world of, oh, you have this many friends on Facebook.
Right.
Where it's almost a high score.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, here we come. We're in the home stretch. Just a couple more ingredients to add to this recipe that we're making.
Yeah.
Next, we're going to add 6,000 metric tons of God-centered.
Wow.
And guys, we got to admit, the analogy is breaking apart real fast here.
Honestly, oh my goodness.
But we're still trying to push on ahead.
6,000 metric tons.
It's a lot. And that just shows how important it is to have our community have God at the center of it.
Yeah. All jokes aside, that is, I'd say, probably the most important, right? Having God guiding our friendships and having God being the center of them all.
Yeah, we need God at the center because in the same way that each human has a God-shaped hole in their hearts, like Pascal talks about, so also every community has a God-shaped hole that only he can fill. None of the other members can take on that role because it's just too big for us.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a really compelling book about what it means to have God at the center of the relationships in our lives. But in that book, he talks about this concept. Christian brotherhood is not an ideal which we must realize. It is rather a reality created by God in Christ in which we may participate.
Wow. Yeah. Puts it into perspective that you're not the center of it.
Right. Yeah, it really does. So those are my thoughts. Do you have any other thoughts on this idea of God-centered relationships?
Yeah, my brain immediately goes to the verse that's often given at marriage ceremonies where it says a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, right? And a church of mine used to quote, it's you, me, and it's God in between. And God is at the center of everything. It's not just 2 people or a group of people. It's God at the center of all of that. And that should be the guiding principle for all of our relationships, not just marriage. It's we are in these communities with others, but more importantly, we are in those communities with God, and we are all just individuals centered around him. And yeah, that should just help propel us into our daily relationships with a renewed interest in the people, because we know that God is fueling that and God is at the center of them. Thus, we should treat them as such.
Good point. If you've made it this far in our virtual cooking show, congratulations.
Honestly,
we're almost there.
We're almost there.
All we have to do now is put it into the God-given oven.
Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily an ingredient, but it's the catalyst that allows relationship to happen. And that's the recognition that friendship isn't just something that I have to make or we have to make, but it's something that God is ultimately making and giving to us as a gift.
Yeah, man. And that's a great lesson for life too, is that understanding that God is the one driving the bus and that we're not the one making decisions on our own. And it's realizing, I saw this the other day and it was really good. It's like, when are you going to let Jesus guide you rather than you just pulling him in the wagon behind you? or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's the idea that we are not the authors of our lives. We think we are. Every conscious decision that we make in our day, we think that we're making it out of our own knowledge or ideas, but it is God inspired, it is God given, and it's God driven. And He's the one that's authoring all of these relationships and these friendships and is ultimately the author of your own life. So anything that you do in your daily life is being authored by the Creator Himself.
That's such a good reminder. Thank you for bringing that up for us all to really be mindful of.
Yeah.
Of course, we have to throw in another C.S. Lewis quote, because what would this be without multiple C.S. Lewis quotes? But really, in the book The Four Loves, when C.S. Lewis is talking about friendship like love, as we've been talking about, he really beautifully and eloquently describes this concept that community is God given. I'll just let his words speak for themselves. He says, "In friendship, we think we have chosen our peers. In reality, a few years difference in the dates of our births, a few more miles between certain houses, the choice of one university instead of another, the accident of a topic being raised or not raised at a first meeting, any of these chances might have kept us apart. But for a Christian, there are, strictly speaking, no chances. A secret master of ceremonies has been at work.
Yeah.
Christ, who said to the disciples, 'Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you,' can truly say to every group of Christian friends, 'Ye have not chosen one another, but I have chosen you for one another.'
Yeah.
The friendship is not a reward for our discriminating and good taste in finding one another out. It is the instrument by which God reveals to each of us the beauties of others."
Yeah, man, that is so true. So good. Wow. So we just finished our recipe for what we believe is healthy, Christ-centered community. And yeah, that was a lot.
Everyone.
Holy smokes. This is going to be a hefty episode. I can already tell.
Yeah.
But it makes up for last week because we had a shorter episode last week. But just kind of recapping that, we started with shared experience, how it is the currency of community. And it's the way that we go deeper with each other just by sharing those experiences together. And we talked about vulnerability, how it really is necessary to love anybody at all, and how we need to put ourselves out there and be hoping that others will do the same when they see us do that. Then we talked about intentionality and how it is so crucial for us to be the ones seeking out the people in those daily friendships and relationships and day-to-day life, and how we live in a passive culture and weeds will choke the path if the path becomes unused. And so we need to travel that path often to that person's house and seek them out and engage with them. And we talked about honesty and how true friends stab you in the front, and that's okay sometimes, and that we need to be spurring each other on even though it hurts. And we need to be walking with one another in the hard times and in the good times. It's not just a walk in the park every day with a friend. It is a up and down roller coaster with that person, and we need to be there through it all.
Next, we talked about humility and how we need a large quantity of humility in our relationships. We talked about how it is better to be filled up by other people than to try to fill ourselves up. And as a result, we have this responsibility to focus our attention on others and focus on building them up instead of just focusing on ourselves. Then we talked about the concept of soft borders and how it's this balancing act between being a clique and being nebulous and unstructured. But rather than those two extremes, trying to seek that middle ground of having a community that's set and is sturdy and yet still has room to change and to grow as time goes on. Finally, the last two that we brought up was that our relationships should be God-centered and are God-given. This isn't just something that we're doing by ourselves for ourselves, but relationship and community is something that is a gift from God, done ultimately for the glory of God. And if you follow that recipe, hopefully now you'll have a beautiful, beautiful community that's Instagram picture worthy. There you go.
And that leads us to the end of this 2-part community series, and talking about the more biblical theology of community and this more practical application of community in our daily lives. And I think it's fulfilled in just a wonderful quote that my pastor said actually just last week, talking about us and Christ. And he said, "We became a part of his community even when we rejected him from ours." And so just understanding with those last two that community is God-centered and God-given. Jesus paid the ultimate price so that we could be a part of his community. And that should encourage you. As hard as that is to hear that we were the ones to reject him from our community, it's such a beautiful picture, understanding that God put other humans on this earth for us to have relationships with and have friendships with. And so really, after hearing this episode, we hope that you are to go out into this world with this renewed idea of friendships and how Christ is the center of all of them. Because even though we rejected him from our community, at one point, he made us a part of his community. And that is more important than anything else.
Yeah, what a beautiful mystery that is.
Yeah.
And I think we can end it there. We'll post resources down in the show notes if you're interested in that.
Check those out.
But yeah, let's just leave meditating on that beautiful idea.
So thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate you hearing us through this very long and very hefty episode. But if you've made it this far, we thank you for tuning in and staying committed to us as we make our way through these really deep and really encouraging topics. Our music is created and produced by our good friend Luke Hall. Go ahead and check him out in the show notes for his Spotify and his SoundCloud if you liked what you heard music-wise. And if you like what you heard content-wise, we would really appreciate a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform that you're listening to us on. Ratings and reviews really help us get out into the real world and help other people to discover our podcast and start listening for themselves. So that would really help us out if you gave us one of those. Next week, we're going to be diving into the theology of games. So we're super excited for this topic. So stay tuned for next Wednesday in the morning. We will be releasing that episode, and we'll continue releasing episodes every Wednesday. Other than that, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for the next one, and we'll see you then.